They found her in the silence between galaxies, not in the grand arms of the Milky Way, not pulsing within the bright spirals of Andromeda, but floating in the vast, nothing, a single flicker of impossible light, and anchored, untouched. The telescopes weren't even looking for her. They were sweeping routine skyfields when one technician noticed the anomaly, a steady point of light where none should be, shining like it had been there forever, yet never seen before. At first, they thought it was noise, a glitch, something artificial, but every reading came back the same. The light wasn't blinking, it wasn't moving, it was real, and it wasn't just a star. It was burning at a temperature no known star could sustain. Too hot, too stable, too wrong. The observatory in Chile sent the data to Geneva. Geneva looped in NASA. NASA woke up their team in Hawaii, who ran comparative spectrographs. The chemical signature was non-existent. No hydrogen, no helium, no carbon, no known element, just a pure, blinding frequency that pierced through filters like a voice calling across eternity. They called it Ananke, after the goddess of necessity and fate, and for a while, the world moved on. Ananke was beautiful, a scientific mystery, but it posed no threat, gave no answers, just sat there in the dark, watching. The press lost interest. But deep in the heart of the European Southern Observatory, a woman named Ilia Vidari couldn't let go. Ilia had spent her entire life chasing anomalies. A gifted astrophysicist, she had deciphered the rotational decay of neutron stars at 26. She had been called obsessive, brilliant, dangerous, but nothing she had ever seen made her question the laws of nature until now. She stared at Ananke every night for 6 months. Then something changed. One evening, as she observed the star, alone, it flickered not like a dying bulb, but like it had blinked at her. Once, just once, but enough to stop her breath. She ran simulations. None of them made sense. Stars don't blink, not alone in the void, not with purpose. And then came the signal. It started as background static in the VL ether, very large array in New Mexico, a rhythmic pulse buried deep in the data, too faint to notice unless you were looking for it. But Ilia was always looking. When she filtered the pulse through a Fourier transform, her heart stopped. It wasn't random, it was prime numbers, the universal language of intelligence. Ananke was speaking. Panic is too small a word for what spread through the scientific community. If it was natural, it was a phenomenon unlike anything in cosmology. If it wasn't, they were not alone, and not in some distant galaxy or hypothetical world. Ananke was only 400 million light-years away, practically next door in cosmic terms. Governments classified the findings, telescopes were redirected, but nothing could stop the whispers. The signal continued, louder, clearer, always the same primes, always perfect, always pulsing like a heartbeat across space. And then, one night, it stopped, just as suddenly as it had begun. Ananke went silent. No light, no pulse. It was gone, but the space it had occupied wasn't empty. It was fractured. The stars behind it were distorted, as if bent around something invisible, as if light itself was being drawn inward. A gravitational anomaly, men's concentrated, a tear in the fabric of reality. Ilia watched in horror as the readings poured in. The light wasn't gone. It had collapsed. Into what? No one knew. It wasn't a black hole. It wasn't even matter. It was a shadow, a void so complete, not even time seemed to pass within it. But the worst part wasn't the collapse, it was the afterimage. 3 days after Ananke vanished, telescopes in every hemisphere caught flashes of light in the skies. Not in space. Our sky, Earth's atmosphere, began displaying impossible patterns at night. Spirals, waves, symbols, not natural auroras, but structured displays, too precise to be chance. The skies were writing. People began to see them in dreams. Mathematicians, physicists, children, waking up with numbers on their tongues, geometric visions in their minds. Entire forums erupted online as thousands reported the same shapes, the same numbers, golden ratios, tessellations, recursive fractals. Ananke had not disappeared. It had moved through something, and it had touched us. Ilia was among the first to dream. She saw a great wheel turning in space, surrounded by light, not made of photons, but of thought. In the center was a voice not heard, but felt repeating one phrase again and again, until it burned itself into her consciousness. You were not the first. She awoke in tears. Her walls were covered in drawings she had made in her sleep, diagrams, orbital paths that led nowhere, but always returned. She recognized one. It was the exact trajectory of Voyager 1, but with one impossible deviation. It turned back. She submitted the drawing to the ESA without explanation. Within hours, agents were at her door, because 2 weeks earlier, Voyager 1 had changed course, without fuel, without command, toward the direction where Ananke once burned, and that was only the beginning. They launched a deep space probe within 48 hours, codenamed Prometheus. It was the fastest man-made object ever conceived, designed for speed, not survival. Its purpose was singular: intercept the trajectory of the altered Voyager and confirm whether the anomaly had an effect beyond Earth. As the world watched, Prometheus crossed the lunar orbit and disappeared into the void. For 3 days, it transmitted nothing, just silence. Then, on the 4th day, a burst transmission arrived, static at first, then a low hum, rising, shifting dot, then came the sounder tone, layered with harmonics impossible to produce through mechanical means. Embedded within the signal was a map, a spiral of coordinates leading not to the location of Ananke, but far beyond it, into the dark space between galactic clusters, a place known only as the Great Nothing, a region thought to be utterly empty, lifeless, cold. The probe had found a new pulse, one older, deeper. Ilia's hands trembled as she overlaid the new signal with ancient astronomical records. The coordinates pointed to a space that had once housed a cluster of stars catalogued in the 1400s, now vanished, as if someone or something had extinguished them. And yet, the pulse continued, the same primes, now accompanied by variables that bent logic itself, numbers that, when plotted, created impossible geometry, shapes that defied dimensions, structures that could only exist if time flowed sideways. The media caught wind of the story. They dubbed the discovery the Eye of Ananke, because if you stared long enough into the simulation of the coordinates, you would see Eta Black Iris, ever watching, surrounded by stardust like celestial lashes. Religions responded in chaos and awe. Some called it a divine awakening, others a harbinger of extinction. Entire movements rose and fell in the span of weeks. But Ilia knew one truth none of them could see. Ananke hadn't come to destroy it, had come to remind, because something was coming behind it. 6 weeks later, a second object was detected. Not a star, not a comet, a perfectly round sphere, larger than Jupiter, reflecting no light, emitting no radiation, moving at an impossible velocity directly toward Earth's solar system. Projected arrival, 11 months, no form of propulsion, no signature, just a silent, flawless globe devouring the emptiness between galaxies. The panic began softly, like a ripple before a tsunami. Stock markets plunged, satellites were armed, superpowers accused one another of secret weapons. But there was no weapon, no defense. The object did not slow, did not change course, did not answer any signal. It simply came. Ilia was summoned to Geneva, not by her university, by a joint council of scientists, theologians, linguists, and defense ministers. They had analyzed the patterns from Ananke and found one terrifying truth: the blinking star, the signal, the skywriting. They were not a greeting, they were a warning, a countdown that the symbols displayed over Earth had reduced in number. Night by night, one spiral disappeared, one ring vanished. It was a clock, winding down to something inevitable. Ilia returned to her observatory, where it had all begun. She shut the doors, silenced her devices, and stared into the stillness of the sky. She thought of her father, who had taught her constellations as lullabies. Of the nights she lay awake, wondering if something out there was watching. Of the moment she saw Ananke blink, and how everything after had felt like falling through a dream with no flaw. That night, she dreamed again. This time, she wasn't alone. She stood on a black ocean. Above her, the stars moved like breath, and in the distance, rising from the horizon like a second moon, was the sphere. But this time it was cracked. From within the crack shone not destruction but memory. And she understood. This was not the first time humanity had reached the edge of understanding. Ananke had been here before, thousands of years ago, millions perhaps. 2 civilizations now dust and myth. It had whispered to them too, given them warnings, offered them a mirror. The sphere was not a weapon, it was a library, a repository of Every civilization that had ever looked up in wonder and asked the question, "Are we alone?" And each time, it returned, not to judge, but to collect what was left. It came when species were at the brink of transcendence, or collapse. The countdown was not a deadline, it was an invitation. She woke with tears streaming down her face. Clutching her notebook, she scribbled furiously, drawing the vision, the map, the crack in the sphere. She had to show them. She had to make them see. But it was too late. They came in the night. Not the sphere, not yet. But those who believed they could silence what was unfolding. The men in suits. The ones who operated behind governments, beyond nations. Ilia's research had become too visible. Her drawings, her lectures, her message that the sphere was not a threat but a mirror, it had gone viral. Millions were listening. Billions were watching. And that was unacceptable. She was detained under the guise of national security. Her observatory sealed, her data seized. The world's most trusted astronomer became an enemy of order. But they were too late, because the sky had already begun to change. Above cities and deserts, mountains and oceans, people witnessed something impossible. The stars began to shift, not move, not like the slow dance of celestial drift. They rearranged, forming patterns recognizable not by astronomers, but by children. Eyes, spirals, trees. The constellations told stories, and in every sky across the globe, at the exact same moment, the same symbol appeared, a hand, reaching out, with 5 stars glowing above the fingers. 5 days remained. Inside the underground facility where Ilia was being held, she closed her eyes and whispered to herself, "You are not the first." She said it like a prayer, like an anchor, because she knew now, this wasn't about surviving what was coming. It was about understanding what it meant to be chosen, to be seen, to be remembered. In the darkness of her cell, her skin began to warm. She opened her eyes, and the wall was glowing, not from a light source, from a presence. Words appeared on the concrete, not written, but folded into the space itself. Letters in a language older than Earth, yet suddenly readable. The memory of a world lives only in those who see beyond it. Then the wall vanished, not exploded, not dissolved, just stopped existing, and standing there, in the open air of a silent night, was a boy, maybe 10 years old, wearing clothes too big for him. His eyes reflected the entire sky. "Ilia," he said, without moving his mouth, "you were chosen before you were born." He held out his hand, and when she took it, she saw everything, the birth of galaxies, the first life crawling from a boiling ocean, the rise and fall of civilizations made of fire and crystal, worlds where beings spoke in gravity, others that sang in magnetic fields. Every one of them had looked up, seen Ananke, and made a choice. Some had turned inward, built walls, weapons, silenced voices like hers. Others had listened, reached out, become part of something greater. The library sphere was not coming to destroy Earth, it was coming to record it, but only what was true, only what we chose to show it. 5 days became 4. Around the globe, things began to change. Wars halted, leaders fell silent. The loudest voices of fear began to crack, because the people weren't afraid anymore. They were watching, not the governments, not the satellites, the sky, and the sky was speaking. Every night, new patterns formed. The stories became more personal. A woman in Brazil saw her grandmother's face made of stars. A boy in Mongolia found a constellation shaped like the toy he'd lost as a child. Across oceans, strangers dreamed the same dreams of flying without wings, of singing in languages they'd never learned, of holding hands with beings made of starlight. The sphere was not just a recorder of civilizations, it was a mirror of souls. On the second night, Ilia spoke again, broadcast live from an untraceable uplink. Her message spread across the Earth. She didn't give equations, she didn't plead, she simply asked a question. If this is the story of our species, what ending do we want to tell? And in that silence, the world chose. People danced under the night sky. They sang. They wrote their names in fields of grain, in snow, in sand, so the sphere could see, not their weapons, not their walls, their wonder, their grace, their hope. And on the final night, the sphere arrived. It didn't land. It didn't orbit, it simply hovered above the Earth, casting no shadow, but illuminating everything. And from its cracked surface came light, not bright, not blinding, but gentle, like the glow of a fire remembered from childhood. And within that light, humanity saw itself, not as conquerors, not as lost, but as children learning to look up for the first time. Then the sphere pulsed once, twice, and was gone, vanished, not fleeing, not retreating, but complete, and in its place, where the stars had once been rearranged, one new constellation appeared, 5 stars, above an open hand, a memory, a message, a monument, to the species that finally remembered how to dream. The world never went back to what it was. There was no grand announcement, no booming voice from the sky, just absence where the sphere had been, where the countdown had ended, where the impossible had unfolded before billions of human eyes. And yet, everything had changed. Borders felt smaller, silence more sacred. Children were no longer taught that Earth was just a speck in an empty void, but a note in a vast symphony. Schools rewrote their astronomy books not with facts, but with questions. Not everything could be explained, and that was no longer a failure, it was a gift. Ilya returned to her home in the mountains. Far from observatories and headlines, she lived quietly, planting trees where satellites could not see. Visitors still came, scientists, poets, dreamers seeking the woman who spoke to the sky. She never gave them answers, only stories, only wonder, because that was what the sphere had given her, not knowledge, but the understanding that knowledge itself is never enough. It must be coupled with humility and hope. One evening, years later, she walked alone beneath a cold winter sky. Snow crunched under her boots. Above her, the stars blinked, unassuming. But she knew better now. She knew they watched back. And as she reached the crest of the hill, she saw it again. A light, not bright, not bold, but familiar. A soft flicker where none should be. Ananke, it had returned. Not in warning, not in fear, but in witness. The flicker pulsed once, and in her mind, like a memory buried beneath the noise of the world, she heard the voice once more. You are not the first, but this time it added, and you will not be the last. Tears welled in her eyes, not of fear, but of relief. The story wasn't over. It never was. Somewhere, light years away, another child looked up into their alien sky. Another star blinked. Another question was born, and so the pattern continued. The stars that shouldn't exist were not mistakes in the fabric of the universe. They were threads, binding worlds, binding species, binding hearts. They appeared when needed most, not to explain the universe, but to remind those within it that even in the darkest reaches of space, there is always something waiting to be found, or perhaps something waiting to find us. So we build our telescopes, we write our stories, we listen to the silence between galaxies, not with fear, but with wonder. And maybe, just maybe, one day, when another species looks up and asks, are we alone? They'll find us not as conquerors, but as echoes, as a voice carried on starlight, as the memory of a world that finally learned to listen.